Our first breakout session will be the in-product improvement committee's session called Advancement in Product. And that committee is actually chaired by Dr. Tommy Perkins. Dr. Perkins has been engaged in BIF activities for a long time, currently serves as Associate Professor and the Dean Hawkins Chair for CalCAF Management at West Texas A&M. And so we're delighted to have Tommy on board and to chair the session today. And I'll give him remote control here. And Tommy will take care of the introductions and legwork on the committee session. And Tommy, welcome. Sounds like everything's working well, and we should be good to go. So the bus is yours, man.
Thank you, Dr. Weber. Appreciate it. Welcome from Canyon, Texas, where the wind never seems to quit blowing. So wish you guys were here today. I want to start off by congratulating Dr. Bob Weber and his entire team. What a great job you guys have done to make this thing happen in the virtual environment. It's been a great event through the first 2 days anyway, so we'll try to make this third one a better day as well. You're really lucky to have 3 outstanding presentations today in our session. I appreciate each and every one of you being here to be a part of this, because it's going to be a good next 6 hours, hopefully. All right, so we're going to start today with the first presentation. Dr. Mike MacNeil received his PhD from South Dakota State University in 1982. He worked for the USDA Agriculture Research Service from 1980 through 2011. He was at first at US Mark, and then he went for about the next 22 years at the Fort Keogh Livestock Range Research Laboratory at Miles City, Montana. As a researcher, he is primarily focused on finding genetic solutions to applied problems that compromise efficient beef production, enhancing systems of national cattle evaluation, using genomics technology to discover quantitative trait loci, as well as to assess genetic diversity in various species. He provides statistical consulting to researchers in many disciplines and works internationally using animal breeding tools to alleviate hunger and poverty. And he also spent a little time with Ultrasound Guidelines Council, and we really appreciate the previous service there, and we look forward to having Dr. Mike MacNeil present some latest research on ultrasound world. Thank you, Dr. MacNeil.
Well, thank you, Tommy. It's a pleasure to be here. It's kind of a foreign experience because I don't know if anybody can hear me or not.
You sound great.
We can. You sound great, MacNeil.
Okay. As I start, I need to acknowledge the contributions of Brady Schmidt, who is a graduate student who did a lot of heavy lifting on a project for the Ultrasound Guidelines Council, and Michael Gonda, who was her major professor at South Dakota State. I'm also appreciative of an adjunct appointment at SDSU and the support I received from the Agricultural Research Council in South Africa. In today's presentation, we will take a deeper dive into the variation that exists in carcass traits that are measured using ultrasound. Okay. And I do not seem to have control of the screen, Bob.
Okay, looks like you're good to go, MacNeil.
Okay, thanks. So, ultrasound technology, developed since the 1950s, is implemented in a straightforward way for the non-invasive measurement of carcass traits on candidates for selection. This technology allows us to have many, many more observations of carcass phenotypes on the animals that are most relevant than would be possible without it. It's really hard on candidates for selection when you slaughter them to measure carcasses. Incorporation of these data into national cattle evaluation is both straightforward and widespread. just as a refresher, the measurement of carcass traits with ultrasound involves really taking scanned images at 3 locations on the animal. The first location is parallel to the backbone and is used to measure intramuscular fat, or IMF. The second measurement is parallel with the ribs at location 2 on this slide, and is used to measure both intramuscular fat, or used to measure back fat and ribeye area. The third measurement used by some breed associations is rump fat, and it's indicated at the scan location 3. In the lower right corner of this slide, you can see the measurements of back fat depth and ribeye area. And if I advance that, you can see then the ultrasound image that results in the measurement of IMF taken in the longissimus muscle over top of the ribs. Let's see if I can, in a box that would be in the area here by my cursor. So let's talk a little bit about the flow of the ultrasound data as it's collected. First, a technician comes to your farm or ranch and actually scans the cattle. Then that data, or that images, are transferred to a UGC accredited laboratory that does the image interpretation. So they're responsible for converting the visual image into data. That data is transferred to a breed association or genetics evaluation service provider, who then transforms the data into EPDs. We certainly hope that those EPDs all get used in the genetic selection process that results in a new calf crop being produced. And those calves again scanned by a UGC certified technician to produce a new set of data. And that cycle goes on in perpetuity. So over the past, we have given lots of attention to the incorporation of data into genetic evaluation systems. But we've really paid far less attention to the underlying assumptions that are involved in that. I think all of us would like to believe that the effects of which technician and which interpretive laboratory are involved in the collection of ultrasound data are relatively small due to UGC certification. And the breed associations would like to believe that the evaluations they produce are not biased by heterogeneity of variants because of their assumptions of the homogeneity of those variances, both additive genetic and residual. So in this research, we set out to test some of those assumptions. The homogeneity within technician variants. So do all technicians scan cattle, produce data from scanned cattle that have similar sorts of ranges? And then are the technician effects actually essentially nil? Are the genetic and residual variances across imaging laboratories truly homogeneous? Do the results from those data coming from different imaging laboratories lead us to measurement of the same trait? Or said differently, is the genetic correlation between those treated as different traits truly one? Another informal way to state those hypotheses might be to ask the question, does it matter who scans the cattle or which lab interprets the data? The data used in this study came from the American Hereford Association, the American Angus Association, and the American Simmental Association. It was collected in the period between 2015 and 2017. All of this data was previously incorporated into the relevant national cattle evaluations. And in the data today, we're going to be concerned with longissimus muscle area, intramuscular fat, and subcutaneous fat depth. And this data set then has associated with it the animal ID. The contemporary group is identified by the breed association. So we didn't reformulate those. We simply took whatever the breed association said was the contemporary group and used that. The technician identification, which includes the technology that technician used in scanning the cattle, and the imaging laboratory that interpreted the data. So all of these data have come through at least two quality control processes. The quality control of the imaging laboratory that says that the image was of satisfactory quality, and the breed association quality control process that says the data was of satisfactory quality. So to briefly describe the data, I've got 3 slides that look very much like this, with the imaging laboratories identified simply 1, 2, and 3. The traits, longissimus muscle area, subcutaneous fat depth, and IMF. We're using the terminology subcutaneous fat depth because Angus combines the measure of rump fat and rib fat into a single measure for analysis, and that is the measure that we got from them. You can see that in these data, there's a sizable number of technicians, an even more sizable number of contemporary groups, and quite a few animals. In the Angus data, there's 93 technicians scanning cattle in over 5,000 contemporary groups, and the total number of records is just under 66,000 records. You can see in the last column of this slide that the phenotypic standard deviations of those data, and those phenotypic standard deviations, as illustrated here by the ribeye areas, might give you some pause as to whether or not the range of data coming out of those image interpretation laboratories is actually the same or not. This is the summary of the data from Hereford with the same sort of organization on the slide. The Hereford data set's a little smaller. There's 66 technicians involved here. There's 4,500 plus contemporary groups of cattle, and overall 43,000 plus records. And again, there's a little bit of variation in the traits, phenotypic variation in the traits coming out of different labs. Simmental data, exactly the same organization with, in this case, 87 different technicians scanning the cattle, 4,400 plus different contemporary groups, 48,000, north of 48,000 records, and again, some variation in phenotypes depending on the interpretive lab. It's this phenotypic variation, oh man, I got to be careful with my fingers. It's this phenotypic variation that we're going to try to tease apart in the subsequent analysis. Okay, now we got to get to, I have to be really careful with my fingers. The statistical model that we used is a little different than what's done in national cattle evaluation. So we have a phenotype for any one of the carcass traits, and that's abbreviated as Y. There's some overall mean for that phenotype. We're going to actually identify in the model the specific technician who scanned the cattle to produce those data. The contemporary group within technician, because if Tommy Perkins is scanning the cattle, he's the only person that scans that contemporary group. But Tommy scans hopefully more than one contemporary group in a year. And then we have an additive genetic effect for the individual animals. And we have the remaining variation that's not explained by those terms that are included in the model. All of this analysis was done using the MTDF or MO software, and all effects in the model were considered random with the exception of the overall mean. In the classical national cattle evaluation, the technician effect would be confounded with the contemporary group, and that contemporary group effect would be considered fixed. In some of the analysis, we switched modes to a multi-trait model where the Y's here subscripted 1, 2, and 3 are the measurements that come from the individual interpretive labs. The usual assumptions about the technician effects associated with the labs being independent of each other are made. That assumption may be open to some question because some of the technicians submit data to more than one interpretive lab, and there may be some correlation there that wouldn't be accounted for in this analysis. We're going to assume the contemporary group effects are likewise independent. That too may not be quite right because contemporary groups on the same farm or ranch might be correlated. But that's no different than the assumptions that are made today in national cattle evaluation. Likewise, the errors are assumed independent, consistent with the assumption of national cattle evaluation. And the animal effects, the additive genetic effects, are assumed to be correlated with each other through the relationships among animals. The one thing that is different than the typical MTDF REML analysis is that we use the Bijima and Bastian approximation of standard errors for genetic correlations. That's because no animal in the data is interpreted by more than one lab. So on to the results, and I'll apologize in advance. Some of these slides are pretty data dense or messy, and I'll try to highlight certain aspects of that rather than reiterate every number on every slide. First, to give you some level of comfort with the data, we estimated heritability in a way that's consistent with most of the literature and with the way that you would see it reported in most of the national cattle evaluations. And that's assuming that the phenotypic variance is the sum of the additive genetic variance and the residual variance. That is, assuming that these are the only random effects in phenotypic variance. And you can see on this slide estimates of heritability that very much are consistent with what we think those estimates are based on the literature. Now, as we dive deeper into this, we're going to change the definition of phenotypic variance to include contemporary group effects and technician effects. So on this slide, and I'll highlight this column would have an interpretation of being heritability. It's the proportion of additive genetic variance that is in the phenotypic variance. But the phenotypic variance here is redefined. And we're going to talk about then the homogeneity of additive genetic variance and the homogeneity of the residual variance as it affects these traits. And I need to pause here just briefly because I have to have another slide. So the next three slides are all similar to this. The next three slides are all similar to the one you're seeing here. There's going to be one slide for each of the traits. And in general, on the slide here for longitudinous muscle area, the additive genetic variances appear to be homogeneous, but I'd call your attention to the data here on the Hereford and ask the question, is the difference between labs 2 and 3 here in additive genetic variance big enough to care about? And likewise, is the 50% increase in residual variance in the Angus data big enough to care about? I don't truly know the answer to that question in a definitive sense, but this certainly says that the labs spread out the breeding values more so. Lab 2 spreads out the breeding values more so than does Lab 3. And so if I had a bull that I really wanted to float to the top, I'd be sure to get him evaluated through Lab 2. For ribeye area, the technician who scans the cattle influences the data almost as much as do additive genetic effects. And I might be concerned about that degree of variation among technicians. So if we move over to fat depth, those results are shown on this slide. And I give you just a second to digest those. Again, the contemporary group variances are large, and we expect that. That's got all the variation from ranch to ranch and feeding program to feeding program and gender of the cattle and so on, all rolled into one wad. And so the fact that those variances explain a lot of the variations not unexpected. With just one exception, the technicians scanning the cattle contribute significantly as a source of variation in the measurements. The proportion of variance in fat depth that's not explained by the model is greater than it was for longissimus muscle area. That's maybe just an artifact of the trait. Again, the additive genetic variances appear to be generally homogeneous. But the difference in additive genetic variance between labs 1 and labs 2 and 3 in the Simmental data is fairly large. And likewise, the residual variances appear to be generally homogeneous, but the difference between labs 1 and 3 in Simmental data also might be large enough that we should be concerned. Okay, so this is intermuscular fat. For many of us, we've paid a lot more attention to intermuscular fat than the other two traits. I think that has to do with emphasis on quality grade when we market cattle. Again, the technician who scans the cattle and with what technology explains a significant amount of variation in this trait. And I would reiterate that, certainly the Ultrasound Guidelines Council pays a lot of attention to the certification of technicians, and particularly with this trait. In the Angus data, Lab 2 appears to produce more additive genetic variance than either Labs 1 or 3. But in Hereford and Simmental, the patterns that we see are quite different. In the Hereford and Simmental data, all the variance component estimates coming from Lab 2 are relatively small, whereas the variance component estimates coming from Lab 3 are quite large. So those two labs really define the range of the data. Okay. So now the next three slides, we're going to show the genetic correlations and the rank correlations for sires. And I want to point out the genetic correlations have the expectation of 1. That is, we expect that the trait that's measured by one lab is the same, genetically the same trait as is measured by another lab, or produced by another lab. And the Angus data here for intermuscular fat typify that expectation. Those estimates certainly make me pretty happy to see that kind of a result. And I'd go to the bottom of the screen and I'd highlight this estimate of 0.78. And that estimate's clearly not 1 statistically, but it's still quite large. But that gives me a little pause for concern. Then if I switch kind of focus to the rank correlations, which are in this triangle, for the sires that were had progeny evaluated by more than one lab, those sires ranked almost identically in the Angus data. So we feel pretty good about that. They ranked, again, almost identically in the Hereford data and nearly as well in the Simmental data. We can't tell you how well individual animals ranked because no lab actually evaluates the scans from the same animal. No two labs actually evaluate the scans from the same animal. We look at subcutaneous fat depth. Again, the Angus data, the genetic correlations are quite large. This one slips a bit, but it's not bad. The rank correlations in the Angus data are very satisfying for the sires. The Simmental data at the bottom of the slide slips a bit relative to the Angus data, and we're a little concerned maybe that they're not exactly the same trait. But the Hereford data really causes us to pause and scratch our heads and say, what's going on here? these data suggest to us that the interpretation by the different labs is really producing measurements that are not leading us to say that back fat in these data is the same trait. This needs some further exploration. These genetic correlations being smaller leads us to rank correlations among sires that are also smaller. Intermuscular fat, again, correlations for the Angus data are pretty good. The rank correlations of sires in the Angus data aren't changing rank very much. Those rank correlations are somebody in that list of 500 sires is moving 10 positions or something. It's not a very big move at all. The correlations in the Hereford data are a little lower. They certainly are less than 1, but they're still in a range that customarily, as animal breeders, we would say these are not bad relative to the expectation of 1. And the rank correlations of sires are fairly satisfying. The Simmental data is pretty much similar to the Hereford data, with the genetic correlations being statistically different than 1, but the rank correlations fairly satisfying for those sets of sires. So in summary, what do I see? I see considerable variation among technicians. For many traits, for all 3 traits, it's as larger than the additive genetic variance. And there's only a few exceptions with a few of the interpretive labs to that general statement. I didn't put up the data dense slide that would show you the individual estimates of within technician variance. With 50 or more data points on that slide, it would be unlegible. But for all traits, the within technician estimates of variance are heterogeneous. That is, the technicians don't spread the cattle out to the same degree. And that might give us a bit of concern. If we switch our attention to additive genetic variance, those traits are generally spread out on the additive. The EPDs would generally be spread out on the additive genetic scale to roughly the same degree by the interpretive labs, but there may be a few exceptions in that. Likewise, with some exception, the estimates of residual variance are generally homogeneous among the labs. The genetic correlations among the interpretive laboratories suggest that the labs may be reporting slightly different traits, not greatly different, but slightly different traits. And there's a particular situation with the Hereford data for subcutaneous fat that really gives us some pause. We might ask, what is it about the Hereford data that's different? Is it something to do with the biology of Hereford cattle? Hereford cattle are known to have heavier hides. Is there something in that hide that we're scanning through that's compromising the measurement? Or is that an anomaly in the data? And at this point, I can't answer that question for you. So we're going to make a few recommendations. it's our judgment based on these data that UGC probably needs to revisit the certification standards. If we subscribe to the thought that it doesn't matter who scans the cattle or which lab interprets the data, then those measurements shouldn't be spread out depending on which technician or lab does it. And some tightening up of that quality control on the part of UGC is valuable. There may be some merit in standardizing the methods of image interpretation that can be deployed across laboratories. Right now, each lab has its own methodology that they're comfortable with and they use. But maybe for the industry, we'd do a better job if everybody used one method. And then finally, I think the breed associations need to do a deeper dive into their data analysis based on the assumptions that they make when they calculate the EPDs rather than just making them. So some closing thoughts. There's some work to do to make ultrasound data the most valuable tool it can be for the genetic improvement of beef cattle. Make no mistake about it. I believe the data collected by ultrasound are of unquestioned value in the genetic improvement. Without it, we don't get measures of carcass traits directly on the candidates for selection. And without it, we have much, much smaller data sets upon which to base the EPDs for carcass traits. And the rank correlations for sires, at least, are generally in excellent agreement across those interpretive labs. I need to acknowledge the UGC both for funding some of this work. We're certainly appreciative of that, particularly Brady, whose graduate assistantship was paid in part by UGC, but also for being willing to allow a third party to take a deeper dive through the data to point out some ways in which we might do better than we're doing today and to disclose that information publicly. All too often, that doesn't happen. I want to also recognize the South Dakota Beef Checkoff, the Beef Industry Council, for the willingness to match the funding of UGC, and the South Dakota Agricultural Experiment Station for, again, matching the funding of our industry partners. Obviously, without the support of the American Angus Association, the American Hereford Association, and the American Simmental Association, we wouldn't have any data to do this work with, and we thank them for that. So thank you, and at this point, I'll take any questions. Tommy, I see there's 3 in the chat room, and I can probably deal with those. Okay. And there's 2 more on the Q&A. And somebody says I should turn off my pointer.
Yeah, based on the essence of time, we may only have time for a couple of those questions, and we can get back to those.
Okay.
We'll on them back, but try to catch a couple of those, please.
Okay. So the first question from Donna Berry in Ireland. Do you know if there's a difference in age, gender of the animals by technician or lab? And I'm not going to read the rest of your question, Donna. The technicians, for the most part, scan multiple contemporary groups. The contemporary groups, part of the contemporary group definition would certainly include gender and age effects or an age slice. So that would get taken up there, but the technicians would scan enough contemporary groups of cattle in these data that would be a contributing factor to the technician variance to any large degree. And from Razi to, and I don't know where Razi's from, I have a guess, but I'm not certain. Why do the Angus results show typically better correlations than the other two breeds? I don't know the answer to that, but I'll hazard a guess. My guess is, one, the Angus is the biggest segment of the population of cattle that these data come from. And because of that, or in part because of that, more of the training of technicians and of the algorithms used to interpret images may be done on Angus cattle than on cattle from other breeds. That may, in fact, play some into that Hereford back fat situation that's a bit troubling. Tommy, you need to tell me when to be quiet.
All right, thank you, Dr. Bengal. We're going to stop there. I've taken screenshots. I've got the other questions that were asked, and we'll have to get back with them. We'll email those back just on the essence of time.
Okay.
And MacNeil, can you see the Q&A box?
I can.
You can answer those. If you wouldn't mind, just stay on. You can type some of those out and respond to those individually. I'll put them in there, and it'll go out to the group so everybody can get those. And
okay.
That'll be great. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. MacNeil. Great presentation. We appreciate it.
The state of Iowa and Iowa State University are proud to host the 2021 Beef Improvement Federation Annual Research Symposium and Convention. The convention will be located in downtown Des Moines with easy access to the airport, hotels, and local restaurants. Iowa State University is just north with its research and teaching farms. Join us in Iowa and experience how Iowa provides the beef industry with innovation to application.